I started working as a police officer a few months ago, and as the rookie, I was assigned to the overnight shifts. The schedule was brutal, 3 12-hour shifts a week, and I quickly learned that the worst incidents happened at night. By my 3rd month on the job, I already had a nightmarish story to tell. It was around 2 or 3 in the morning, and I was patrolling my designated route. The roads were empty, and the only illumination came from the streetlights lining Warren Street. This particular street was one of the few well-lit areas in our town, surrounded by a mix of closed stores and dense forest. As I turned onto Warren Street, my attention was drawn to a coffee shop's parking lot. Something wasn't right. The lights inside the coffee shop were on, which was bizarre considering it always closed by 6 p.m. on weekdays. I frequented the place often and knew the owner well. I hit the brakes and reversed back to the parking lot. My curiosity piqued. I parked by the curb and got out of my car, my heart pounding. The door was unlocked. I stepped inside, calling out the owner's name, but the shop was eerily silent. My voice echoed in the empty space, sending shivers down my spine. Then I heard it, a faint sound coming from the basement. I didn't even know the coffee shop had a basement until that moment. I found a door leading downstairs and unholstered my flashlight. The descent into the darkness felt like an eternity. There was no light switch, so I relied on the narrow beam from my flashlight to guide me. At the bottom of the stairs, I paused, trying to steady my breathing. The basement was pitch black, and I could barely see beyond the small circle of light. Suddenly, the noise came again, louder this time. It was a strange, distorted sound, almost as if it were both electronic and organic. It came from a back room. With my flashlight raised, I cautiously stepped into the room, which looked like a makeshift office. I stood still, listening intently. After about 30 seconds, the sound erupted again, this time from an air vent in the corner. I shined my light into the vent, but the grill blocked most of the light. Desperate to identify the source, I pressed my ear to the vent. My blood ran cold. I could hear faint breathing inside. My heart raced as I angled the flashlight differently, trying to peer into the vent. The beam must have hit the right spot because I saw something that made my heart skip a beat, a gloved hand inches from my face. I unholstered my gun, shouting for the person inside to come out. The vent door wouldn't budge. It was screwed on tight. I heard the person inside moving away, the sound gradually fading. Who were they? How did they get in there? And why? I called for backup and soon other officers arrived. We did a thorough investigation, calling the owner to help us search the place at that ungodly hour. There were no signs of forced entry, no unscrewed vents, no broken windows. Our investigation concluded after a few hours. Whoever had been in the vents was gone, leaving no trace. But the sounds I heard haunted me. Not just the breathing, but that strange, distorted noise that echoed through the vents. To this day, the memory sends chills down my spine, a constant reminder that some questions remain terrifyingly unanswered. My parents own a small convenience store in our town. It's a modest establishment, selling groceries and snacks from local suppliers. They've been running the store for over 20 years, and my dad is especially dedicated, often keeping the store open late into the night. When I turned 16, I began helping out, and by the time I was 18, I was working full-time while also taking online college courses. One night, it was just me closing the store. My dad had taken the night off, and my mom was dealing with some health issues. It was usually quiet in the last few hours before closing, with only a handful of customers coming in. That evening, around 9 p.m., the store was almost empty. I had just grabbed a sandwich from the fridge for a quick break when a man walked in. I set my sandwich aside and returned to the front counter, waiting for the customer to finish shopping. After a few minutes, I looked up and didn't see him. I scanned the room again but still couldn't spot him. Thinking he might be in a corner I couldn't see, I waited a bit longer but he still didn't appear. Feeling uneasy, I stepped out from behind the counter and began searching the aisles. In the second aisle, I found him crouched at the end, staring at the floor. "Sir?" I called out. The man immediately looked up at me, then stood and continued to stare. His eyes were wide and unsettling. After a few seconds, he quickly walked out of the store without saying a word. I went to where he had been crouching but found nothing unusual. The whole situation was creepy, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I checked the front door to make sure he had left the area, but it was dark outside and I couldn't see him anywhere. I went back to the counter, feeling more alert. 3 hours passed without another customer. It was now time to close up, and I was ready to go home. I locked the front door, grabbed my bag, and headed towards the back door. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the store. Startled, I stopped and listened. The noise had come from the back. Slowly, I walked towards the back hallway. At the far end, I saw dust floating in the air and the back door slightly ajar. Standing there was the same man from earlier, staring at me with those same wide eyes. I froze. He didn't look angry, but his expression was completely devoid of emotion. Taking a few slow steps back, I then turned and ran towards the front, leaving the store and crossing the street. I called 911 and then my dad, who rushed over to make sure I was okay. When the police arrived, the man was gone, but he had left a crowbar behind. Nothing seemed to be missing or stolen, leaving his intentions a mystery. It was clear he was unstable, and his plan could have been anything. Fortunately, I didn't have to find out what it was. I used to work at a small 24-hour market on the outskirts of a town in rural Texas. It was a busy place during the day, but during my working hours, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., things were usually quite calm. Most of the customers were truck drivers and night travelers stopping by for coffee and snacks, and occasionally to refuel. It was a particularly quiet night, with few people stopping by after midnight. I was watching a movie on my laptop, trying to stay awake. The road in front of the market was deserted, and I didn't expect to see many cars passing by until dawn. Suddenly, the headlights of a car briefly illuminated the inside of the store as the vehicle pulled into the parking lot and stopped near the entrance. The lights went off, but no one got out of the car. I turned my attention back to the movie, thinking it might be someone taking a nap or making a phone call. A few minutes passed, and the car was still there with no one getting out. My curiosity grew, but I continued watching the movie. Finally, I heard the car door open and closed my laptop, expecting someone to enter the store. A disheveled-looking man, wearing a shabby coat and a baseball cap, walked into the store. He gave me a brief glance before heading to the drinks section. I watched him discreetly as he picked up a bottle of water and began walking through the aisles. Something about his behavior made me uneasy, but I stayed at the counter, trying to appear unconcerned. He lingered in the aisles for a while, and when it seemed like he was going to leave without buying anything, he finally brought the bottle of water to the counter. As he passed by the register, he looked at me intently, his expressionless eyes sending a chill down my spine. "Do you need anything else?" I asked, trying to sound friendly. He just shook his head and paid for the water. After the purchase, he left the store, but instead of returning to the car, he stood outside, staring at me through the window. The feeling of discomfort increased. I continued pretending to ignore him, but my heart was racing. He finally returned to the car but didn't leave. He just sat in the driver's seat staring in my direction. I tried to go back to watching the movie, but my concentration was broken. The whole situation was making me nervous. A few minutes later, he got out of the car again, this time walking towards the store with determined steps. With a sense of urgency, I ran to lock the door before he could reach it. I managed to close and lock the door seconds before he tried to pull it open. He pounded on the door forcefully, looking directly at me with a threatening expression. "We're closed," I shouted, hoping he would go away. Instead, he kept pounding on the door and yelling, demanding that I let him in. His insistence and aggression were frightening. I grabbed my phone and threatened to call the police. This seemed to stop him for a moment. He stepped away from the door and returned to the car. I waited a few minutes before approaching the window to see what he was doing. To my relief, I saw that he was starting the car and finally leaving the parking lot. My relief was short-lived when I realized that he had just driven across the street and stopped again, continuing to watch me from there. My nerves were on edge, and every little noise made me jump. The minutes dragged on until another car finally pulled into the parking lot. It was a regular customer, a truck driver who stopped by every night for coffee and a quick chat. When he entered the store, I quickly told him what had happened. He looked at the car across the street and then back at me, shaking his head. "That's not right," he said. "I'll stay here until you finish your shift, just to be sure." His presence was comforting, and I was grateful not to be alone anymore. Finally, when my shift ended and the next employee arrived, the strange car was still there, but it didn't make any more threatening moves. I thanked the truck driver for his company and drove home, still feeling the effects of fear and adrenaline. The next morning, I told my friends and family the story, who advised me to stay alert. I never saw that man again, but for the rest of the time I worked at that market, I always felt a slight paranoia, expecting that he might return.